into the criteria that we've used to reach the right option. And so they're the things that really you've been talking about today. So in my paper I talk about three things that you might want to go back and have another look at. And so I'll just go over them very briefly and then I'll talk about process. So the first of them is whether the selected option meets the expected increase in demand over time. And we've already talked about that to a large extent. So obviously it's vital that the selected option can meet the current and future criteria. And that was all based upon, if you look at the paperwork, it's all been based upon an assumption that there was going to be no growth in activity. That assumption is not proven to be correct, and the Clinical Senate have looked into that, and then work has been undertaken to look into that. So fine, you're going to need some extra beds, and you're going to need some extra beds from the word go. And listening to what Rachel was saying earlier, it seems as though some work is going on to try and create capacity for those extra beds. But it will be something which does need to be put in place if you're going to have confidence in this solution. And one of the things that you need to think about, is raised by the Clinical Senate, was around rehabilitation, because unless you have the rehabilitation sorted, you will not be able to get people out of those beds and on the road to recovery. So I think there's also a question raised by the Clinical Senate around whether the commitment was there from commissioners to get that rehabilitation model set up. So, and also, even if you're able to mitigate some of the effects of that, you're still going to see that increase in growth over time. It's only a prediction, but you're still going to see it, and that needs to be covered off. So that's fine. You're going to see an increase in beds. That's going to affect any of the options that you select. But then you've got to ask, does the preferred option have the capacity to expand to cover that increase? And as I'm aware that Derwent Valley is a PFI hospital, sometimes those hospitals struggle to build in extra capacity. And so there's a question mark over perhaps not only whether you've got the rehabilitation model in place to be able to deliver that, but also whether Derwent Valley would have the capacity to expand. So that's point number one. Point number two is whether the existing capacity will be taken up by the population of South East London. Now, I know there's always been conversations about this, so I'm not going to rehearse those arguments particularly, and I take the point that the services will always flow across borders, and borders are a little bit false, and we're all trying to get on in a country together. But I think we need to appreciate there is a risk that the capacity hasn't really been perhaps fully understood or modelled. We're aware that if you what we do know is that even assuming that the guidance that was agreed as part of that South East London Commissioners meeting, if that goes into place, and even if it's followed, then you're going to see 200 strokes each year that are currently seen at the PRU coming to Derwent Valley. So that's a quarter of the beds immediately filled up with those. There's a question mark over whether that operational guidance is going to stick. How long is it going to be valid for? Will that change? And I'm aware that the Stroke Programme Board looked at that and found there was a possibility of a fundamental shift to happen over time, despite that agreement. So there's a risk regarding that as well. And so, regardless of what mitigations you put in place, again, it wouldn't stop people from just rocking up at the relevant hospitals, and so that again puts the pressure on there. So those are two key aspects. And the third one is whether the option that's selected unnecessarily disproportionately affects areas of high deprivation. And it's not really built into the way that the criteria have been set out that we've looked at. And so it's something that if that is a relevant factor that people really feel strongly about, then this is an opportunity to look at it again as part of that review process, knowing that it has a greater effect on people from deprived areas. Option B is proposing a phased approach, and we've talked about some of the disadvantages that could arise from that, so I won't go over those. But the question that I have is recognised that this model here will have a disproportionate disadvantaging effect on some of those deprived communities. But is that avoidable? If you picked a different option, would those other options have mitigated those effects? And I'm not sure that the work that's currently done, that may be something picked up as part of the decision-making business case, but or maybe further research needs to be looked into that to compare that data against the other four shortlisted options, because you only have the data in relation to the preferred option. So if you look at, for example, option D, with Medway Maritime being located within an area of high deprivation, it's just clear from the geography that would mitigate those effects to some extent. But these are questions where you don't want to look at those factors and try and think again. They're really important things, but the scope of my review was to look at some of the procedural flaws that were